If we had sought to please men, we should have been badly rewarded. But we serve a higher master, who will not withhold from us his reward. You could even say that this expulsion was a sort of relief for Calvin, because of the amount of abuse he had to put up with from ungodly, recalcitrant church members. The response to this crisis, on the other hand, though, by Louis du Tillet, Calvin's friend and travelling companion, whom some of you may remember from last week's speech, du Tillet's response was very different. In the middle of this struggle between the reformers and the ungodly faction in Geneva, in the middle of the struggle, even before the reformers were banished, du Tillet, a self-professed Protestant, lost faith in the success of the Reformation and left Geneva. He returned to the Roman Church. Jesus Christ describes such people as stony ground hearers who, seeing tribulation because of the word, are offended and rejected. And du Tillet was dead wrong. Dead wrong regarding the future of Geneva. He thought the Reformation was finished there, but he hadn't faith to hang in there. And dead wrong concerning the future of the Reformation, which is still going according to the will of God half a millennium later. Now, some of you might be thinking at this point, what's with the subtitle of this speech? Calvin's battle for the Reformation, the Geneva Years. Sure, they kicked him out of Geneva. He was there less than 20 months. Some Reformation that was. But to run ahead of ourselves somewhat, in case some of you can't bear the suspense, I should let you into the secret that Calvin later is recalled to Geneva. From 1538 to 1541, having left, or rather been banished from Geneva, Calvin labours in the free imperial city of Strasbourg. Strasbourg is near the current border of France and Germany. It's in Alsace-Lorraine, historically a region claimed by both the French and the Germans. And it is now the seat of the European Parliament, Strasbourg. Now at this time, Strasbourg was called the New Jerusalem by the persecuted Protestants who fled France for refuge. Others called Strasbourg the Antioch of the Reformation, because, if you remember your catechism classes from your youth, because Strasbourg was like Antioch in the book of Acts. Both Strasbourg in the 16th century and Antioch in the 1st, both of them were prominent in the spread of the gospel. Antioch marked the beginning of Paul's first, second, and third missionary journeys, and the end of his first and second missionary journeys. And it would have been the end of his third missionary journey, but he was arrested, and they ended up appealing to Caesar, and so went to Rome. That's Antioch. Strasbourg, on the other hand, was prominent in the spread of the gospel because it was at a sort of crossroads between France and Germany, and to the south, Switzerland, and perhaps you could even say to the north, the lowlands, now Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The parallel between Antioch and Strasbourg goes further because both cities had a good number of great church teachers and leaders. And when you go home, if you can remember to look up Acts 13 verse 1 and see the prominent church leaders in Antioch. Well, Strasbourg especially had Martin Bucer and other men, these names may be new to you, Capito, Hideo, Niger, Matthias Zell, Sturm, and now Calvin. In Strasbourg, Calvin was appointed Professor of Theology in the university and pastor of the French refugee church, numbering 400 to 600 souls. Calvin wasn't paid for his labours in Strasbourg for the first 5 months. And if you remember from last week, you'll see that at least this is an improvement, because he wasn't paid for the first 6 months that he worked in Geneva. Now he's getting paid more promptly, just 5 months after he starts. So in part to support himself, Calvin starts to take in as boarders young French students, as well as his brother Antoine, who joined him in the Reformation cause, and his half-sister Mary. Within a year, and being quite frugal I imagine, Calvin was able to purchase citizenship in Strasbourg, something he wouldn't have for quite some time yet in Geneva. These 3 years in Strasbourg saw Calvin grow in his convictions and experience. It was in Strasbourg that Calvin published the second edition of the Institutes of the Christian Religion, 1539, which was an enlargement and improvement on the first edition, 3 years before, published in Basel. Not only the second edition of the Institutes, but Calvin's first commentary on the book of the Bible, Romans, was published in Strasbourg. And Romans, of course, was the key biblical book in the Reformation, because it teaches, above all, righteousness in Christ by faith alone, and that overthrew the whole papacy. It wasn't only as a writer, though. Calvin also developed in Strasbourg as a reformer of church worship. Partly with Bucer's help, Calvin established a Reformed church liturgy, or order of service. He insisted, for example, that baptism and the Lord's Supper only be administered in the church's public worship, and not on any individualistic basis in people's home. The sacraments belong to the church's public worship as a body together. Calvin also began congregational singing of the Psalms, and had printed in Strasbourg in 1539 a French Psalter with 19 Psalms. It takes time translating it from the Hebrew and then putting it in verse or meter to be sung by the congregation, but he's making a beginning. Church oversight and discipline were instituted in the French refugee church in Strasbourg too. Calvin wasn't able to see that established according to the Word of God in Geneva, and they expelled him. But the people he's working with in Strasbourg are a better sort. These are people who have been persecuted for the profession of Jesus Christ. These are people who want the Word of God to rule over them. So they're willing to submit to church government. Calvin explained to these godly saints the difference between the yoke of Christ, necessary and wholesome church discipline, and the tyranny of the Pope, a difference as wide as heaven and hell. Don't confuse them, and submit to the oversight of the church. We should add at this point too that it was from that crossroads that was Strasbourg that Calvin attended colloquies, that is, theological discussions in southwest Germany, in Frankfurt, Hagenau, Worms, and Regensburg. He attended these theological discussions between the Protestants and the Roman Catholics.